Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and welcome. I'm Nozipho Mbanjwa and this is Invest Africa. Now, as the old adage goes, there are only two certainties in life. That's death and taxes. But in Africa, this isn't always the case, as billions leave the shore in illicit outflows. For amongst other reasons, there is a lot of tax avoidance on the continent. This deprives those countries of the much needed development that tax contributions can make. But as the experts may tell us, it's not as clear-cut as that. We'll get to that conversation and that insight in a while. But first, let's take a look at how Africa fares amongst its global counterparts. And we'll start off with the global corporate tax rate. What we've done is that we've pulled data from KPMG. They've given us a snapshot window between 2012 and 2014, giving us the key trends in tax in Africa and globally. And what we see here, if we look at these bars where the blue represents Africa, the green North America, the dark orange the Asia average, the red Latin America, and the black Europe average. If we look at global corporate tax for Africa, we're seeing a falling trend. 29.02 in 2012. In 2013, that dropped to 28.29 and fell even further in 2014. We see that figure there at 27.85. And it seems as if it is in line with the global trend, because if we just pick out the European average as a comparison, we're seeing that although it's significantly lower than Africa in 2012 at 20.42, it also falls all the way to 19.68 in 2014. So in terms of falling global corporate tax rates, it seems as if Africa has kept to the global trend. Let's turn our focus now and look at global individual tax rates. Again, we've got a two-year window from 2012 to 2014. And what we're seeing here is a contradiction to the first graph, where we're seeing a rising individual contribution to taxes. In Africa, again, in 2012, we were sitting at 28.53 in terms of individual contributions. That was up in 2013 to 31.4, and in 2014, all the way up to 32.32. So we're seeing a rising trajectory there. And again, this is in line with what we're seeing with global trends. Just to pick out North America as a comparison, again, 32%, 34.3%, 34.3%, again, a moving average. We had a bit of a dip in Asia in 2013, but that was self-corrected in 2014. So interesting movements that we're seeing. Let's now finally take a look at a country comparison in Africa and see how the countries have done, where our blue represents Kenya, our green represents Nigeria, dark yellow here represents South Africa, Mauritius in the red, and Angola in the dark. Now, lots of interesting insights to be made from this particular graph. Let's start off with Mauritius. Consistency there, 15%, 15%, 15%, and of course the lowest corporate tax rates amongst its African counterparts, raises a lot of questions about Mauritius being seen as a tax haven and whether they've been able to shake that brand perception of the island nation. South Africa, in contrast, which is the dark yellow, 34.55, the highest in 2012, coming in 2013 as slightly below Angola at 28% and steady at 28% in 2014. Angola, though, also fairly high corporate tax rates. It is consistent, but at 35%, it dwarfs its African counterparts. So these are some of just the insights that one can take from this two-year window that we've been given by KPMG. But I do have guests in Nigeria, in Kenya, as well as in Johannesburg, South Africa, to share their insights. Let me introduce now Venter Labuschagne. He is a KPMG partner responsible for international tax, and he's here in our Johannesburg studio. In Lagos, we're joined by Theophilus Emuwa. He's a partner at Aelex Legal Practitioners. And in Kenya, in our Nairobi studio, we're joined by Kwame Owino. He is the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs in Kenya. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. Kwame, let's start off with you. Has tax been an effective tool, not only in your particular market, but in Africa broadly, to act as a redistributive means to redistribute wealth in your markets?
Certainly, I think in Kenya, yes. Let's start with the fact that Kenya's tax to GDP, tax collection to GDP ratio has been about close to 20%, which regionally is one of the highest. So yes, certainly it is. Now, on the spending side, about whether government spends efficiently, that's altogether a different matter. But I think for some services, you can tell about redistribution, and especially in the expenditure on health. Basic health services and basic education, which is the first 12 years of education. So you see that government spending in these areas has a redistributive effect, because the people who gain the most, or rather the benefit incidence in terms of who gains from the taxation or the spending on education, public education in Kenya, at the primary school level, it tends to be the lower income groups, largely because they educate their children through public schools. Now it becomes less so at the secondary school level, and when you go to universities, it's completely regressive in the sense that the higher income groups gain more from public spending on those areas. It's the same with healthcare. So using taxes as a redistributive mechanism is effective for some services, but it is not as effective for other services. So it shows that there's still some work to be done around spending taxes in a way that actually ensures that the redistribution is real, but most importantly that actually it meets public objectives.
Those are fantastic insights coming from Kwame. Let's take the conversation to Nigeria. Let's bring Theo into the conversation. Theo, give us a sense of what the key challenges have been for Nigeria in terms of deepening and broadening the tax base so that it can fulfill that redistributive function.
Broadening this tax base is one thing. Whether this leads to the redistribution of wealth is a different issue. Now, with regard to broadening the tax base, I think one of the challenges has been finding, government finding or getting information about who the taxpayers are. Now, we have a country with a very large population, 160, 170 million, depending on who's counting. We have a federal government, and then we have 36 state governments. At each of these levels, you have a legislature. So we have one federal legislature, then you have 36 state legislatures. And with different, organs of government at each of these levels. So it's a pretty expensive structure we operate. Now, getting the information about taxpayers is a challenge for government at each of these levels. The federal government in Nigeria collects taxes from corporations. The state governments collect taxes from individuals, from employees. So you can see that there isn't just one database to be managed. There are probably 36 or 37 databases. That's part of the challenge. Some states in Nigeria are beginning to overcome these challenges and are collecting quite, a good amount of the taxes that they should collect. How they apply these funds when they collect it is a different matter.
Yeah. Again, what he's done, or Theo's done, and I want to bring you in now, Venter, is that he's distinguished between broadening the tax base as one part of the conversation, and of course, looking at other issues that regard redistribution. Very important issues in the South African context, given the history of apartheid. So I'd really like your comment on that, but also give us a comment on whether we've developed the capacity to have effective tax institutions on the continent.
I think there's a definite improvement in the collection of tax. We've seen that the tax systems across the continent have become more sophisticated. There's been an increase in the collection of revenue, and there's been a lot of aid and help and commitment from the international community, the IMF, the World Bank, in order to assist with the improvement of these structures.
Let's talk about, again, the redistributive tool in South Africa. Has tax lived up to its promise in this context?
Yes, that is a very controversial question. The collection of tax is one side, as Theo alluded to. The other side is, of course, how that money is spent. South Africa has a very good record of being transparent when it comes to creating budgets, showing how money is spent. But there are certainly some areas in the public sector where spending is needed more, and where we haven't yet reached the levels where we need to get to.
Let's take it back to Nairobi. Kwame, let's bring you in on the capacity front. To what extent has the Kenyan government been able to build tax institutions that are not only credible with integrity, but also have the capacity to collect tax?
Well, it does. I mean, one of the things that you see in Kenya is that tax growth in real terms, because inflation has been high, has actually been going for 11, 12 years consistently. And that in itself tells you that the administrative capacity to actually collect the taxes does exist. The revenue service in Kenya, which is called the Kenya Revenue Authority, has very highly qualified professionals. It has a good budget for training its own professionals, and also picks in people from the private sector in Kenya who work with it. So in terms of that capacity, that definitely, I think it seems to be up to the task.
Theo,
so that's a first. The
I just want to jump in there, and maybe we'll come back to you, Kwame. I want to get a sense from Theo whether we've moved to a space in Nigeria where we can talk about a almost corruption-free tax system, because again, this is a big indicator for foreign direct investment and integrity of the economy, really.
I mean, you know, measuring corruption is never a pure science. You know, a lot of the times you depend on rumor and hearsay. But I will say that the tax collection at the corporate level has certainly improved a great deal. It has been growing every year for the last, 10 years or so, due to a number of things. The government has given the tax authority at the federal level a certain degree of autonomy. They get their funding directly from budgetary allocations at the beginning of the year. They no longer have to depend on a ministry to pass the funds to them from month to month. So when the budget is being passed for the federal government at the beginning of the year, the allocation for the tax authority is a line item. Also, this amount is made a function of collection. In other words, they're entitled to have as much as 3 or 4% of what they collect, although that depends on what will be approved for the year. So they have been able to employ better, more competent and better equipped personnel, and that has led to improvement in collection. The drop in non-oil revenue has also meant that we must increase, the drop in oil revenues has meant that we must increase non-oil revenues as far as tax is concerned. So again, there's an incentive to collect more, and there's less of an incentive not to collect, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. So on the note of creating the right incentives to collect more, let's take a short ad break. But when we come back, let's also take Theo on the comment that he's made that corruption is not a pure science. We'll see you after the break. Welcome back to Invest Africa. Tonight we're talking about tax in Africa. Remember that you can be a part of these conversations. You can tweet us at CNBC Africa and of course using the hashtag Invest Africa. I still have with me my guest, Venter Labuschagne. He's a KPMG partner, is responsible for international tax. Theophilus Emuwa, partner at Aelex Legal Practitioners, and Kwame Owino. He is the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs in Kenya. Gentlemen, welcome back. Venter, let's start off with you. We often talk about tax reforms across the country. Is the legal framework that enables, gives tax institutions the muscle to enforce some of their rulings or their activities, is that keeping pace with the reforms?
I think looking at Africa as a continent, of course, there's a lot of differentiation between the various tax systems. You have a lot of complexity. Ideally, you want to develop a tax system whereby you have a system where your taxpayers would enforce the law themselves. You want to make it easy for them to pay taxes. You want to have a tax system that is clear, that is transparent, and that is easy to follow. You also want to show that the money which is being generated by the taxes is spent in a manner which contributes to the taxpayer wanting to pay those taxes. To answer your question, I think again, there are various challenges facing the continent in various countries. Looking at South Africa specifically, we have robust tax legislation. We've got a robust authority collecting those taxes. And I think taxpayers have a fair shot at challenging any decisions that they feel have been taken that may not be right.
Let's go back to you, Kwame, and let's talk about multinational corporations operating on the African continent. Have we gotten to a point where we can say we're winning the game or we're turning the tide with regard to illicit financial outflows?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, given the estimates that are actually just provided a few weeks back about how much illicit financial flows leave Africa. So definitely we are not winning. I mean, the sums that are leaving the continent are substantial. I mean, taking those estimates as accurate, we are not. But to my mind, it also suggests that we have very complicated tax systems for the kind of economies that we have. And what that does then is that we establish loopholes that then allow companies to evade taxes, but where possible to actually avoid those taxes. So my view is that simpler tax systems that are less amenable to interpretation one way or the other is probably what is required. And the second point is just basically integrity in our revenue collection systems. I mean, it's not without doubt that some of the most some of the people who face temptation in terms of reducing the tax liabilities of both multinational corporations, but also corporations in Kenya, are people who work in the revenue service, because definitely the discretion that they can apply would save some firms a lot of money. So obviously it's not just multinationals, but I think there's also something about strengthening systems on this back and integrity at the revenue collection services as well.
Theo, what we're hearing from Kwame is that there should also be a focus on strengthening processes and systems. Let's get a sense of what the Nigerian government is doing to deal with mispricing across corporates and the illicit outflow problem that we're seeing across the continent.
Well, I think one thing that the Nigerian government, as well as a number of other governments in Africa have done, is to introduce transfer pricing regulations. Because one of the ways that funds are moved from one jurisdiction out to another is through, transfer pricing. So a related company in another jurisdiction might charge a higher price to its sister company in Nigeria, for example, and that way profit is moved from here to there. By introducing transfer pricing legislation, then the tax authorities are able to ask for information from these multinationals, which will help the tax authorities determine whether the appropriate pricing has been, adopted. Now, transfer pricing is not an easy thing to manage in terms of administration. So, they are having challenges, but ultimately that would be the way to go. And even in developed countries, that is what is done. But having said that, the legislation is not where the challenge is in most countries. It is the administration. The laws are good enough, but whether the people who have to apply the laws have the competence and the skills and the tools is really where the challenge is.
And of course, Venter, we've spoken about building capacity and skills and tools. Maybe let's just zone in on that point that Theo makes around collaboration amongst countries. To what extent are we seeing these collaborative efforts on the African continent to try and bring down transfer pricing?
Well, I think key to this process is the Africa Tax Administration Forum. We see that a number of countries, I think 36 in total now, have subscribed to the objectives of the forum, and it assists governments in dealing with the issues of transfer pricing, the whole debate on BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting, and also to communicate and to share information in order to improve enforcement.
Let's take that lesson and bring it back to you, Kwame. I think there's a balancing act that African governments are also grappling with here. The one side is having attractive tax incentives for multinationals to come into the country, but also at the same time making sure that you're not opening up to even more vulnerability. Would you say that that balance is being met?
I actually think that those tax incentives are some of the avenues for corruption, to be honest, partly because there's very evidence out there in the literature that shows that tax incentives alone, especially for Kenya and African countries, have influenced foreign direct investment. So the kind of entrepreneur who insists on a tax incentive of one kind or another as a precondition for investment is obviously perhaps not the one that you should give priority to. My view is that at the Institute of Economic Affairs, our thinking is that if you make domestic investment conditions good enough, and level the playing field, then obviously, whether it's a foreigner or a local investor, would have an opportunity and an incentive that applies to everybody. But some of the incentive schemes that we've had have been applied very poorly designed to start with, and often they've just led to the leakage of public money away from countries that really need them desperately.
Theo, what has been the Nigerian experience? In my mind, I'm thinking of Mauritius and how it has positioned itself as very attractive on the tax front, and how we're seeing the island nation doing phenomenally well in terms of development and the GDP numbers that they're putting in. How does that compare with what we're seeing in Nigeria when it comes to tax incentives for foreign direct investment?
Well, we do have quite a raft of incentives for foreign investors, but like Kwame rightly said, and I think I agree with him, the investment decision, would happen anyway, regardless of the incentives, because the investors are looking for a market, and once they feel that the market is attractive enough, they'll probably will invest regardless of incentives. But of course, if they see that an incentive is available, they will ask for it. Why not? They have issues like political profile, country risk to deal with. So tax is probably not what drives that decision.
Venter, you're nodding as the gentlemen are speaking, so I'd like to get your comment in, but also let's talk about the role of banks in facilitating tax havens in and around the continent.
Well, firstly, I agree completely with what both the gentlemen have said. Our experience has shown that the tax rate as such is not the key driver when it comes to making investment decisions, and that actually a far more important part of the thinking with our clients would be the clarity of the tax and how simple it is for them to administer and how simple it is for them to understand. As far as your question goes about banks, of course, banks hold the purse strings literally, and they control the flow of funds. Again, transparency, very, very important. And we've seen the revelations that's come out recently about money leaving borders in various countries, not always in the most legitimate way. So I think banks have an important part to play.
And of course, small and medium-sized enterprises, Kwame, I want to bring you in on this point. Small and medium-sized enterprises are also a very important part of the consideration of how we administer tax and how tax might in itself either impede growth or support growth. What has been the experience in Kenya as to how tax is administered for those businesses?
Well, I think Kenya is still struggling with finding a happy mix about how to specifically apply taxation to small and medium-sized enterprises. You're right; they're going to have to play a bigger role in the development of employment, but also contribution to tax over the medium term and to the long term. But we haven't found, because a couple of years back we tried a form of taxation, which is just basically a flat tax to them on their revenues, but it didn't work. And again, we are reviewing. My view, though, is that if we find a tax system that actually applies, is simple, both for small and medium-sized companies, and that does not involve a lot of discretion and interpretation on the part of Revenue Service or the Tax Administration Authority, then that's good. It may be a lower tax than is. If it benefits bigger companies, that too is okay. But to the extent that you can level that and allow medium-sized companies to compete as well, that's good. But what this tells us is that a complicated tax system is not necessarily the most efficient one. So we seek an efficient tax system which may involve as few hurdles as possible for the purposes of ensuring compliance, whether by a big or a small firm.
Yeah. Theo, so a flat tax rate for small and medium-sized enterprises not working in Kenya. What has been the approach in Nigeria in terms of maybe looking at small and medium-sized enterprises and how we administer tax for them?
Well, there is no differential in tax rate corporate tax rates for companies of different sizes. Everybody pays the same corporate tax rate. Perhaps one thing I can say may have been an inadvertent a benefit is that for many years, even up till now, the level of tax collection was not very high. The tax authorities were not that proactive in terms of collecting. So it was an academic point. Now they are beginning to collect more and more, and we will begin to see the issue come to a head. and maybe the small and medium scale enterprises may then see the need to form a lobby group that would convince governments to treat them differently.
Well, there you have it. We said at the beginning of the show there are only two certainties, that's death and tax, and I think we're all taxed out at the end of this show. Thank you so much for making the time to join us tonight. A big thank you to my guest, that's Venter Labuschagne. He's a KPMG partner and he's responsible for international tax. Theophilus Emuwa, he's a partner at Aelex Legal Practitioners. And Kwame Owino, he is the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs in Kenya. For you at home, remember that we do want to hear from you. Please do send us your comments. The details are on your screen. For myself and the Invest Africa team, it's goodbye for now.